Ready for a deep dive today? We're going to unpack all the juicy stuff about relationships, what makes love last, how to date without driving yourself crazy, and friendships. Can't forget those. They're like the secret ingredient to a happy life, wouldn't you say?
It's true. And this guide we're diving into today, it's got it all.
It really does. And, I was thinking about it before we started, and it seems like people are always looking for that perfect match, like the one.
Right, like it's all about finding the right person.
Exactly. But this guide, it takes a different approach.
It does. It's more about becoming the right person yourself.
Mm.
Like working on yourself is just as important as finding the right partner.
Okay, I love that. It's like focus on yourself first and the rest will follow.
In a way, yeah. It starts by really digging into like the core of what makes romantic relationships work long term. And it's not just those butterflies you feel at the beginning.
Right, it's got to be more than just a fling.
Totally. We're talking about building a real connection. Emotional connection, trust, got to have respect, being able to compromise with each other.
Yeah, the real deal, like you said. But then it also talks about physical intimacy being important.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes shy away from talking about that, but the guide's right. It's a vital part of a romantic relationship. It's about vulnerability and connection,
Yeah,
expressing your affection physically.
I can see that. So it's about being on the same page emotionally and physically to create that strong foundation.
You got it.
But relationships have their ups and downs, right?
Yeah.
How do you keep that spark alive as time goes by?
The million-dollar question. This guide dives into that too. It talks a lot about how crucial open communication is, especially when things get tough.
Yeah, that's when it matters most, right? But sometimes it's so hard to actually do it.
For sure, for sure. Like, there's this one example in the guide. It talks about how to approach your partner when you need to have, like, a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
Instead of starting with blame, like you always do this, try saying something like, hey, when this happens, it makes me feel. Put the focus on how it makes you feel.
That's such a good point. Like, I know when someone comes at me with accusations, it's like defensive walls up instantly. But if they tell me how they feel, it's easier to be understanding and actually work together to figure things out.
Absolutely. And that's what the guide's getting at. It's about being empathetic, even when you're arguing.
So basically, choose your words carefully.
Exactly.
And speaking of choosing your words carefully, the guide doesn't shy away from some of those other, sometimes uncomfortable topics either, does it? Like setting boundaries.
Totally. That's a big one. Setting those healthy boundaries early on in a relationship is so important, even though it can be tough.
For sure. So what's the guide's take on that? How do you set those boundaries without, I don't know, feeling selfish?
It's funny you should say that because the guide really stresses that setting boundaries isn't selfish at all. It's about protecting yourself so that you can actually be your best self in the relationship.
That makes sense. It's like you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. One example they give is setting boundaries around your time and availability, especially when you're just starting to date someone. Like, it's completely okay to say no to a date if you need some me time.
Right. Putting yourself first isn't selfish. It's essential.
100%.
That reminds me of something else that really stood out to me in the guide. It's all about knowing yourself, especially when it comes to dating.
Yes. There's this line, if you don't know what you want in a partner, how can you spot them?
So true.
It's like, imagine going grocery shopping with no list. You'll probably end up with a bunch of random things, but not what you actually need.
Okay, I love that analogy. So how do they say we should figure out what we actually want in a partner? Like what our relationship shopping list should include?
They suggest taking some time for self-reflection. Think about your values, your goals, the qualities you admire. You can even literally write a list. Figure out what your non-negotiables are. What are those deal breakers for you?
Okay, that's good advice. And while we're talking about dating, there's some really good stuff in this guide about navigating those early stages of dating. Because honestly, sometimes it feels like a jungle out there.
It really does. And it's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of a new connection or feel pressured to find the one immediately.
But like everyone's in a rush, right?
Exactly. And the guide encourages us to slow down, be patient, let things unfold organically.
That is definitely easier said than done.
You're telling me. And, speaking of things that are easier said than done, let's talk about friendships. This guide dives into the importance of strong friendships, which is something we often overlook. But they're so crucial for a happy life.
Yes, let's talk about that. I love how the guide emphasizes friendships too, not just romantic relationships. So what's their take on what makes those friendships last?
Well, it actually emphasizes a lot of the same things as romantic relationships, which I thought was interesting.
Really? Like what?
Well, things like open communication, mutual respect, shared experiences, and even physical touch, though obviously in a different way than with a romantic partner.
Right, like a hug from your best friend when you're feeling down. That means the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We often think of those things as being exclusive to romantic relationships, but they're important for all our close relationships because, honestly, healthy communication and respect, those are important no matter who you're dealing with, right?
Makes total sense.
And speaking of communication, something the guide really stresses is that conflicts are inevitable in any relationship. Doesn't matter if it's romantic or platonic, they're going to happen. The important part is how you handle those conflicts.
So true. Yeah, but that's easier said than done sometimes, right? Like, we've all been there. Things get a little heated, and suddenly you're saying things you don't really mean.
Oh, tell me about it. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment.
Exactly. But the guide has some advice for how to handle those situations, right?
It actually has a whole section on conflict resolution, and it's full of these like practical tips you can use in any relationship, really.
Ooh, I like practical tips.
Right. One thing that really resonated with me was the focus on using I statements.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Like, instead of saying, you always forget to call me back, it's more like, I feel hurt when I don't hear back from you. Something like that.
That's exactly it. It's about taking ownership of your feelings and expressing them in a way that's less, I don't know, accusatory, I guess.
Right. Because if you come at me blaming me, my defenses are going to go up immediately.
Exactly. And then it's just a fight. But if you say, hey, this is how this makes me feel,
It opens up the conversation.
yes, and it gives the other person a chance to understand where you're coming from.
That's such a good point. It's like that saying, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly. This guide is full of these little golden nuggets of wisdom, I swear.
Okay, give me another one.
All right, how about this? Sometimes the best way to resolve a conflict is to just walk away. Like take a
Yeah.
break, cool down before things escalate.
Oh, the old take a time out
And
strategy.
sometimes that's the hardest thing to do in the moment, but it's so important.
It's true. Sometimes you just need a minute to get your thoughts together, you know?
100%.
Okay, so we've got communication, boundaries, conflict resolution. This guide covers so much ground,
Mhm.
but it doesn't stop there, right? It also talks about self-care, doesn't it?
It does. And this is a big one. They argue that you can't really be present in any relationship, romantic or otherwise, if you're not taking care of yourself first.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. It's so true.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in taking care of everyone else, and then we forget about ourselves.
Totally. So what does the guide suggest when it comes to making time for self-care, especially when you're juggling all these different relationships?
What really stresses the importance of making time for yourself no matter what. Even if it's just 30 minutes a day to read or take a bath or just do absolutely nothing.
Oh, doing nothing sounds amazing some days.
Right. But it also emphasizes the importance of things like getting enough sleep, eating well, moving your body. Those basic things, but they make such a difference.
They really do. When I'm sleep deprived, I'm a completely different person.
Right. And it affects everything, how you interact with people, your patience, your energy levels.
Yeah.
It all goes downhill.
So basically, taking care of yourself, it's not selfish. It's like a prerequisite for being a good partner, a good friend, a good human, basically.
Exactly. And get this, the guide actually says that maintaining your own hobbies and interests can actually make your relationships stronger.
Really. I always thought the opposite. Like, you need to spend as much time with your partner as possible to keep the relationship strong.
That's what a lot of people think. But the
Mhm.
guide's point is when you have your own things going on, it actually makes you more interesting.
Oh, that's a good point. Like, you have more to talk about, you have more to bring to the table.
Exactly. And it's also about nurturing your own sense of self outside of your relationships.
You're not relying on your partner to be your everything.
Exactly. The guide argues that when you're happy and fulfilled as an individual, it spills over into all your relationships.
You bring that positive energy with you wherever you go.
Exactly. It's like adding spice to life.
I love that. Okay, so what about keeping that spark alive in long-term relationships? Because that's something that a lot of people struggle with.
It is, and the guide has some advice for that too. One thing they stress is the importance of continuing to date your partner, even if you've been together for years.
Wait, like actually go out on dates?
Yes.
I love
It
that.
doesn't have to be anything fancy, just making that time for each other, even if it's just cooking dinner together at home.
I like that. So it's all about being intentional, making the effort to connect with each other.
Exactly. Because it's so easy to let that slide when you get comfortable in a
It
relationship.
is. It's like you get stuck in a routine.
Exactly. But making that effort, even in small ways, can make a big difference.
So it's not just about romantic relationships, it's about nurturing all our relationships. Because even the strongest friendships need some attention, right?
Absolutely. They don't
Agreed.
just thrive on autopilot.
Hmm.
We have to make an effort, to nurture them, to spend time with the people we care about, to show them that we care.
It really is. It's like anything else you care about, right? You
Okay.
got to put in the time and effort if you want it to last.
100%.
Yeah.
And it actually reminds me of something else on the guide that I thought was really fascinating. It talks about the connection between our friendships and, believe it or not, our romantic choices.
Ooh, okay. Tell me more about that.
So they're basically saying that our friends actually have a bigger influence on who we end up with romantically than we might think.
Really? I never thought about it like that, but it kind of makes sense. Like you're drawn to people who fit in with your group, right?
Right. Like we tend to be drawn to partners who share similar values as our friends,
Yeah.
people who kind of mesh well with our social circle.
It's like they're creating this like relationship ecosystem without even realizing it.
Uh-huh. I love that. A relationship ecosystem. You're totally right. It's like this web of connections that influences our choices, even subconsciously.
So it's not necessarily that your friends are telling you who to date,
No, not directly.
but they're still shaping your world in a way that leads you towards certain people.
Exactly. It's really interesting to think about.
It really is. This whole deep dive has got me thinking about all the different ways our relationships connect and influence each other.
Me too. And speaking of connections, there was one last thing from the guide that really got me thinking. It asks, what role do our own insecurities play in the challenges we face in relationships?
Ooh, that's a tough one. But I think it's an important question to ask ourselves, you know?
Totally. It's like, are we unknowingly sabotaging our relationships because we're afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to get hurt?
I think we all do that to some extent. It's like those defense mechanisms kick in without us even realizing it.
Exactly. But the guide is saying, hey, once we start to understand our own baggage, our own insecurities, that's when we can start to break those negative patterns and build healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
That's powerful. It's like self-awareness is key.
100%.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We've covered so much ground today. If you had to sum it all up, like, what's the biggest takeaway you're walking away with from this deep dive?
I think for me, it's that building healthy relationships, whether they're romantic, friendships, family, whatever, it's a constant process. Like it takes effort, it takes self-awareness, it takes a willingness to grow and adapt along the way.
Beautifully said. It's not always easy, that's for sure, but it's so worth it in the end. And this guide really lays out like a roadmap for how to do it.
It does. And don't forget, like, even though this guy is a great resource, don't be afraid to lean on your support system too. Your friends, family, even a therapist if you need it.
That's such an important reminder. Having those strong connections in your life makes all the difference.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap things up here.
Sounds good.
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned some new things about building and nurturing those meaningful connections in your life.
And be sure to check out the show notes for links to this amazing guide and some other helpful resources.
Yes. Until next time, everyone, happy connecting.